All right, so as promised, I wanted to show you guys a few things about literature review, some example kind of giving you context for when I say put the sources in conversation with each other and things along that line. So first thing, it comes from a previous paper that College Board actually went through and annotated and highlighted, trying to label places where they did things well. And so they reference rows. This is from the old rubric, but it hadn't changed what we were trying to do. So rows 2 and 3 largely apply to the lit review about including multiple perspectives and putting them in conversation with each other. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on here on this particular paper. It starts off, I forget what's on that page. Many modern scholars champion the compatibility of Islam and the secular state, they claim. So I think in this case, it's the fact that they're referencing the individuals collectively, right? They're talking about different research, and this is research that I think they've either previously mentioned or they're about to talk about, right? That they're going to go through and now talk about the challenges of pluralism, whatever that source is, and they're going to go through and follow all of these sources that are supporting this idea that many modern scholars champion the compatibility, blah, blah, blah. Right? Okay? So that's an example here. Let's see what this is looking at. I think they're just showing them talking about a credible source. So I don't think there's any necessary connection back to another source directly, but I think that these two, the challenges of pluralism and the book, The Caliphate Question, they're similar because they're under that umbrella paragraph saying many scholars, right? And then down here later, it kind of talks again, all of these authors speak of Islam's compatibility with secular society, right? So they have all of these sources that are focusing on the compatibility of Islam, right, with secular notions. But then when the green starts, this is really where the conversation happens. These scholars claim that a caliphate is an unnecessary form of government. A caliphate is a religious-based government, right, from the religion of Islam. So just giving you background for this particular paper. But then look at the very next paragraph. Other Muslim scholars assert that the caliphate is mandated by Islam. So they've set up this whole, people think, nope, we don't need a caliphate. It's not really what the religious text said. It's not a necessity. And here are some sources, and they have these things in common. But now I'm going to switch over and talk about these sources that are contradicting that. And are going to talk about how, no, there needs to be a caliphate if you truly are practicing, right, the religion as intended. So that's where this is going to move into next with all of those sources, right? So there's kind of more of a visual of putting sources in conversation. Again, it's what we did with our web diagram, trying to group sources by subtopics, but also try to find places where they might contradict each other as well, and make sure you're making those connections, connect the sources in your paper. Right? That's what putting sources in conversation is really about. So then, to that end, let's actually see sources in conversation with each other. So this is a student who is looking at translations of religious texts and the accuracy of those translations, right? I know these both seem to be religious themes. Don't panic. They're just ones that I have. Not that that makes it a good project or not. And they actually, their teacher had them make a little video of the sources talking to each other. So each little picture is a source. And yes, they're kind of making some stuff up whenever there's back and forth, like them asking each other questions, but it gets the idea of how they're connecting to each other, right? And then how we bring in other sources. So let's take a look. You see, it's 3 minutes. It's not very long. I don't know who this student is.
I think it's kind of weird that Jesus and Paul didn't agree about Christianity. Shouldn't two leaders of the same faith teach things that even if they're not the same, are at least reconcilable?
I bet it's the dynamic equivalence theory.
The what?
My theory that translation can never be perfect because context is super important and affects everything.
That makes sense, but how does that relate to what I said?
Well, Jesus was raised Jewish, and Paul was Roman and hated Jews, at least for a long time. So, they had different cultures and beliefs informing their interpretations of faith. That's a bit of an extreme example. Usually interpretations aren't contradictory like theirs were, but it all comes back to context.
Actually, I wrote a book on it, not on Jesus and Paul, but rather on the translation between Jewish languages and non-Jewish languages. It's important to take Jewish perspectives into account when translating Jewish words.
But How do you account for the differences between Jewish religious beliefs and the cultures and non-Jewish ones? Are there categories?
You betcha there are.
How did you just appear out of nowhere?
It's Kabbalah magic. Anyway, there are 10 categories of differences between Judaism and Christianity that we've found.
Yes, we can back that up with our databases as well.
Seriously, how are you guys doing this?
But anyway, given that the Bible was written in the Jewish languages Aramaic and Hebrew, and then translated into English and other non-Jewish languages, I wonder how the contextual differences change each Bible's interpretation.
They should be pretty similar, shouldn't they? I mean, it's the same text.
Nah, we are all totally different. We even have outright mistranslations, and the event of all of our creations were very political and not necessarily linguistically objective.
Well, we've kept a very old copy of the Hebrew Bible since the 12th century, and considering how often holy books got burned back then, that's pretty much as good as you're going to get. Also, we have very strict policies about transcription, so you can rest assured that there aren't any mistakes in our copy. When we're transcribing the Bible, if we make a mistake, we might even have to rewrite the whole page, depending on the mistake, and there's a lot of double checking. So if you want to check back to our Hebrew version of the Bible, here it is.
Then all we need is someone to do it, and maybe a whole bunch of Hebrew speakers to try to mitigate translation bias.
But where will we find someone to do it? It's so much work.
Look no further. I volunteer.
Yay. Okay. So I know it happens pretty quick. I'm going to put this video online if you ever want to go back to it to actually kind of really pick up the nuances. But the idea is starting off with Jesus and Paul, that apparently they were teaching some different versions of Christianity. They weren't completely aligned. And then that led to this dynamic whatever theory that sometimes the background, the context that a person comes from can affect their interpretation of their faith. And then that person wrote a whole book on it but didn't focus on Jesus and Paul, moved more into Jewish perspectives and how translating you had to account for the Jewish context versus if it was a different language, right? So there's all of that connection. And then they bring in, well, then so what's the difference between Christianity and Judaism, right? Are there some big differences there in terms of context? And that was that group that was like, yes, we found 10 different differences between these religions, so that you could start to see what context might have shaded their translations. And then it goes into the actual books themselves, right? And how those are not necessarily all the same version, right? That the political history and the getting burned and destroyed and how they were made, right? But then it ends with that one group saying, well, we probably have what is considered the most original version of a religious text, right? That, hey, these are all the things that we've done over the years to maintain the validity of that text. And then, okay, so now this is the project that I'm going to do. Right, so you see how they all kind of fit in together. It's not like they just went one person by one person. They were connecting the dots, finding places where things were similar, right? And then also building on things. I'm sure they had to give some background information about religious texts at one point. That probably happened when they had the little picture of the Bible. I don't know if the student added any more to this. I don't know who this is. I don't know what their paper was. I don't know how it scored. I don't know anything about it, but I thought it was an interesting visual in terms of thinking of your literature review. Right. And so I think I mentioned to you guys yesterday, but if you thought about that particular video, I would say there were, at least 6 different pictures of sources that were talking to each other. And that's, I think, a good ballpark, 6 to 8 sources, right? Some of you might get more in, but 6 to 8 sources that you're having good quality conversations about, I think is appropriate for your lit review. Now, you can cite other sources for stats, perhaps in your intro, and some of them will probably come in your method section if you're referencing method aspects that you're borrowing or adopting or modifying, right? Some should also maybe come in your discussion whenever you tie your findings back into your research, right? So that's kind of where your sources would come. Okay, so with that, I did just clarify here that for your first draft that's due on Sunday, the requirements: name, double-spaced, 1,000 minimum word count, right? The name and 1,000 word was already on the paper. I added the double space. That will open up on Thursday. Right? Questions for me? Okay, 2 priorities right now. First draft, data collection. Pick one, right? I did announce a 3rd period, so you might start seeing more surveys popping up, or they might be doing your surveys and just leaving comments on the EDSB group because they can't talk to you in person. But that's still an option. And remember, capstone students, the research students, cannot be your participants. We are too intimately involved with your projects. Whenever we start doing peer review, I actually pull both periods together. So sometimes you will be peer reviewing somebody in third period or seventh period, right? They're all going to be mixed together. So we're all going to know each other's projects on some level, so we can't be each other's participants. Conflict of interest, if you will. Okay. All right, then with that, pick something. You got things to do, get it done.